Shirley Jackson published We Have Always Lived in the Castle just 3 years before she died. It was her final publication. It is among one of her popular works, which also include The Lottery and The Haunting of Hill House, which was actually adapted into the film The Haunting. Jackson's work is known for realistic settings that often involve horror or the occult. She deals with domesticity, feminism, and other issues surrounding the home. In this particular work, there seem to be elements of Southern Gothic. However, the story itself probably takes place in Northeast U.S., probably the Vermont area. Let's take a close look at the characters. We're introduced at the beginning to Mary Catherine Blackwood, also called Mary Cat, who's 18 years old. She lives a fantasy, thinking she has magical powers and thoughts of living on the moon. She doesn't like to clean herself. She's always in trouble, which questions was she actually a bad child. She also shows sociopathic tendencies, always wishing others were dead, acting out as a murderer, and she's very antisocial. And we know from her past that she did murder most of her family and set her house on fire later on in the book. She's very possessive of Constance. She never wants her or anything else to change. She's also obsessed, as we find on the first page, with Amanita phalloides, the death-cap mushroom. She sees the village and others as rotting and wishing they were all dead or in agony and that she was walking on their bodies. Even in the orphanage, she wished them all dead. And finally, we have to question, was she actually abused by her parents? If not physically, certainly mentally, based on some of the descriptions. So let's take a look at Constance Blackwood. We know that Constance is agoraphobic, even though she's trying to break out of that with the help of her friends. She's very domesticated. In other words, always cooking, focusing on the garden, cleaning the house, and being the caretaker for Uncle Julian. And she's oddly in denial, it seems, about the whole murder, but allows Uncle Julian to obsess about it. In some ways, we can say that she's treated like the maid/cook of the family. And we also have Julian Blackwood, who survived the arsenic poisoning. He's constantly working on his papers, which are about that fateful day, and he's obsessed with that day. And finally we come to Charles Blackwood, the 32-year-old cousin. He appears and tries to woo Constance in the idea to get the family's money. So that's an introduction to the characters. And what we need to understand, though, and point out is that this story is told in first person, and we're getting Mary Catherine Blackwood's point of view. Therefore, we have to question the reliability of what we're actually reading. If we know that she has some mental issues and that she fantasizes and lives in this fantasy life sometimes, then we have to question if what she is seeing and describing to us is true. The first lines in the book raise a few red flags about her sanity. She says, "My name is Mary Catherine Blackwood. I am 18 years old and I live with my sister Constance." Okay, so that's pretty straightforward. But then, "I have often thought that with any luck at all I could have been born a werewolf because the two middle fingers on both my hands are the same length, but I have had to be content with what I had. I dislike washing myself, and dogs, and noise. I like my sister Constance, and Richard Plantagenet, and Amanita phalloides, the death-cup mushroom. Everyone else in my family is dead." That is a very interesting introduction by her, and it does make us think that, okay, there's part of you that seems to be this normal 18-year-old girl. Then on the other hand, you think you could have been born a werewolf, and you have a fascination with poisonous mushrooms. So with that being said, let's also take a close look at some potential Gothic conventions, even though, again, we have to question some of this. First is the setting. The mansion itself is on a large wooded estate. So in a funny way, we have Jackson giving us all three conventional settings here for a Gothic work. There is the mansion, dark forest, and then later on the house itself, as described in the title, is described as a castle. But then there's the question of witchcraft in this book. Well, we know that Constance and Mary Cat both have a knowledge of herbs, fungi, and gardens and such. In other words, the natural witch. Then we have Mary Cat's magic, burying marbles and silver dollars and nailing the book to the tree, and really blaming Charles's intrusion on the book falling from the tree. Then we also have the black cat, Jonas, the pet for a witch, or let's call it the witch's other or familiar. Later there are references to Mary Cat and Constance walking down the stairs like two witches. And in chapter 6, there's a reference to the gingerbread house. And there's also this very strong connection with nature, almost a Wiccan connection with nature. So it does beg the question, is this a supernatural tale, or, let's say, are we dealing with natural witches in this case? That comes down to interpretation. And it also comes down to the reliability of our narrator. Okay, 3. We deal with superstition. This story is an original tale of superstition or the haunted house. So all legends and superstitions have to start somewhere. Just like the legend of Sleepy Hollow begins with the Hessian trooper dying and being buried by the tree, and just like any small town ghost stories start with some kind of action that then gets built up into legend and myth, the story of Mary Cat and Constance is the legend. We see how they live their lives and how the townspeople feel about them, and then there is the great fire at the house, and they hole themselves up in the house afterward. And then they become the talk of legends and mystery and so forth, and time goes on, and no one sees them. However, they do pay them respect by giving them food, similar to, let's say, similar to a sacrifice almost, as in, if you trespass on this land, or if you mock the spirits, you have to give them something in order for them not to harm you or your family. So that's a key part in this story regarding the beginning of a legend or a superstition. Okay, to run through the others relatively quickly, the physical grotesque we obviously see with Uncle Julian, and in the way Mary Cat perceives others in the town. And there's the mental grotesque, which again is also Mary Cat's view. The villagers' hatred seems to be a bit much. Julian's obsession with the murders. Constance's agoraphobia. We have Mary Catherine's sociopathic and fantastical escapism when she's talking about the moon and talking about spells and so on. We also see Charles here as the mysterious stranger. The damsels in distress being Mary Cat and Constance, as in some ways they are attacked through the story by the villagers, specifically attacked also when we get near the end of the book. And of course the paraphernalia of death, the family itself being dead, poisons, Mary Cat notices snakes, and Mary Cat's visions of people dying or rotting and screaming in agony. So some areas for analysis. First is domesticity. Everything in the story seems to be so scheduled. Constance remains on schedule, and Mary Cat's trips to town are on certain days at certain times. The cleaning, breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and gardening, it's all set. This also pairs with repetition. They don't really know how to break out of that pattern, and then once they do break out of the pattern, it is very uncomfortable, and it seems as though bad things happen. So what kind of message is Shirley Jackson trying to get across regarding domesticity? Is she saying that to be too domesticated can drive you crazy, can be all too consuming, basically can have a negative mental effect on you and prevent you from being able to reach your, let's say what Maslow would call self-actualization in order to reach your full potential? Is she saying that domesticity is a good thing and that people in the world are really cruel, and that the more that you go out into that world, the better the chances are that they are going to come and they're going to destroy your home, they're going to tear you down? It raises a lot of questions about relationships with others and how strangers perceive others. And to be very brief with this potential point, are we dealing with lesbianism or incest a little bit? Constance becomes Mary Cat on page 165, as she is dirty and in Mary Cat's hideout, dirty like Mary Cat always seems to be. And when we talk about lesbianism and incest, in this case we're not dealing with it on a physical level, more of an emotional level. Why is there such a connection between Mary Cat and Constance? Is Constance simply playing the protector? Mary Cat's 18 years old. Why is she not moving on? Why is she clinging to Constance this whole time? It's one way to read this book and analyze this book from start to finish, if that's all that we're looking at. But there are so many other points that can be made, and that doesn't really deal directly with Gothic. Another analytical focus is the summer house. On page 137, Mary Cat imagines being treated like a queen by her dead family. This shows that she may have been treated harshly. Her mother is described as being quite the control freak and possibly agoraphobic as well, as she forced her husband to put the fence up and lock out the rest of the world from the path. There is also her saying, "Punish me? You mean to send me to bed without my dinner?" as Charles wants her punished. So it does show her giving a real warning, and we get the connection between her connecting with her family, saying, if you punish me, something bad's going to happen to you, similar to Charles getting that kind of response from Mary Cat. Of course, you have the other analytical focus of witchcraft and superstition, which we talked about earlier when going over the conventions. Here we also have a distinction between the rich and the poor. The Blackwoods are obviously the wealthy family, because the town itself seems to be very poor and very resentful to the Blackwoods because of the way that their parents treated those in town, basically not letting them walk through their property to shave off several minutes from a commute. We can also see Mary Cat's perspective that when she goes through and she sees the townspeople, she has a very negative opinion of them. And again, we have to question reliability here. Are these people really as mean as she thinks they are? Are these people really thinking bad things and treating them differently? Or is that simply her perspective? Does she just think that they are because she feels like she's in a completely different world than they are, that all of them are beneath her? And then finally we have the moon. Throughout the novel, Mary Cat constantly talks about being on the moon. On page 165, she says that they are finally on the moon while in the hideout with Constance. And the moon itself, again, is this fantasy world that Mary Cat goes to, and we have to question, what does the moon actually represent here? If we want to go back to the lesbianism and incest, does she say that we're finally on the moon because Constance seems to have finally given in and given Mary Cat what she wants by kind of becoming her and starting to look like her? The moon theme here is something that you'll want to pay special attention to and think about the implications that it actually has. Okay, finally, let's take a look at repetition. Uncle Julian consistently says it really happened, and he mentioned this several times, and then Mary Cat says on 165 after the fire and such, after Julian is dead, that it really happened. Then we have Mary Cat's constant repetition of deadly fungus and plants. She's constantly bringing this up. And then, of course, the rhyme. Mary Cat said, "Constance, would you like a cup of tea?" "Oh no," said Mary Cat, "you'll poison me." And then Mary Cat consistently saying, "I wish they were dead, I am walking on their bodies," and then referring to the rot. When Constance and Mary Cat are talking to each other, we have this repetitive exchange of, "I love you, Constance. I love you too, my Mary Cat." What's the implication there? And of course we have Jim Donnell and Joe Dunham repeating in chapter 1 about Joe fixing the step and not getting paid for it. And finally, Uncle Julian's focus on that day, that fateful day. There are other repetitions through the work, however, those are some of the key points that are brought up. Why such repetition, and what is Shirley Jackson trying to tell us? What is she trying to show us here?